We now move to the next part of our service, the Martyrology Service. And it's been the custom of Beth Yeshurun for many, many years. We are often honored by survivors of the Shoah. But in our day and age, unfortunately, our survivors, there's not as many as we would like around to bless us with their presence. As the years go by, we will lose more and more of these precious survivors. So let this be a reminder to us to go out and, while we can, sit in their presence, learn from them, and give them the due kavod, respect that they deserve. As we continue their stories and continue to bless their memories and continue to do what we can to make sure that nothing like it ever happens again. And so in that spirit, for the last several years, we've had second-generation survivors. And so today, it's my honor to invite our member and my friend Gregg Rosenberg to address our congregation.
When Rabbi Strauss first approached me to present a speech in this day, the subject was supposed to be completely different. Before the pandemic arose, Melanie and I were to accompany Rabbi Strauss and Lisa on what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. We were scheduled to go, along with a diverse cross-section of the Beth Yeshurun community, to visit concentration camps in Poland and Germany. As has everybody's plans this past summer, the trip fell victim to COVID. The original intent was for me to come here today and tell you about the trip and what we learned on it. Obviously, I had to shift gears on the fly, but have had several months to do it. It has long been a Beth Yeshurun tradition, as Rabbi Strauss just mentioned, to have either a survivor or a second-generation survivor address the congregation on this very solemn day as part of the Martyrology Service. I got to Houston in 1983 and have always been inspired by what has come off this pulpit from these speakers. It has never ceased to amaze me how much I've learned from what was shared. The history of the Holocaust is horrific, but it's a story that has to be repeatedly told. I don't expect to do it as well as those who have preceded me on this pulpit, as we have had some very articulate speakers who actually lived the atrocities, as well as some very well-spoken descendants, direct descendants, who have shared their parents' experiences from what was shared with them. Though I am not technically a second-generation survivor, the reality is that we're all survivors, second generation or otherwise. The way my life worked out, the Holocaust didn't affect my immediate family. My paternal grandparents were born here or they came to the States at a very early age, 2 years old, my grandfather. My maternal grandparents got to the States before the Holocaust affected them. In reality, however, anybody in my generation is a second-generation survivor because the Holocaust is something we are all in together. I certainly grew up affected by it. My first memory of the Holocaust, or my first memory of realizing what the Holocaust was, came about very innocently in the mid-1960s when my parents contracted with a man to paint and hang wallpaper in a house we had just moved into. Now remember the timing. This is 1969, 1970. We were probably 25 years removed from the Holocaust at that point. Today, sitting here before this congregation, it's 2020, and we're 19 years removed from 9/11, which everybody has a very distinct memory about. So the reconciliation, time-wise, was pretty much the same. The difference was, I remember as a young child in Hebrew school, not really learning about the Holocaust, but the big talk back then was Soviet Jewry and their struggles to emancipate at that point. We really didn't have a lot of Holocaust education, at least we didn't. I couldn't have been more than 10 years old at the time, but there's something about this situation with the paper hanger which radiated with me until this day. The painter was a man named Mr. Bloom. My mother's first language is Yiddish, and she would speak with Mr. Bloom almost exclusively in Yiddish. That really wasn't a surprise because that's how my mother spoke to a lot of people, including her own father, and it was commonplace. But there was something very different about Mr. Bloom. When he rolled up his sleeves, you could see that he had a tattoo numbers on his arm. My first reaction was that other than a letter, I remember this distinctly, other than a letter which preceded the numbers, the first tattooed number on his arm was 36. Now, that was significant, not because it's an easy point to make on a dice table. As a young boy growing up on Long Island, I was fascinated that a painter would have Jerry Koosman's uniform number on his arm. Jerry Koosman was a pitcher for the New York Mets. I didn't know what was going on, but I asked him about the number and why the others were there. It was that day I got a lesson about the Holocaust that to this day I will never forget. My mother found herself in a very difficult situation. She had explained something that she had never thought about explaining before to somebody who probably wasn't prepared to hear it. I got it all. Gas chambers, senseless murders, separation from family. No punches were pulled. It was very direct. We are, in fact, New Yorkers. I heard all about things that as a young child I never could have imagined. I learned that Mr. Bloom was one of success stories, that he made it out and was able to establish a business on his own after liberation. It was made clear to me that this was the exception and not the rule. Shortly after that, I learned how it affected my family. My maternal grandmother actually passed away 2 years before I was born. I'm actually named for her. She was the oldest of 10 children. As a teenager, her parents in Poland sensed that trouble was coming and sent her to New York to live with a relative at a very early age. It was there she met my grandfather, and they raised a family of 3, my mother being the youngest in a 20-age span between siblings. I learned growing up that my grandmother had a younger sister who was actually younger than my own aunt. It's my Aunt Sonia, my mother's Aunt Sonia. Her story was fascinating, one of courage and a whole lot of luck. Sonia was the youngest of 10 who was, along with the entire family, herded off to concentration camps. Because she was young and pretty, she was assigned to easy tasks, working in the kitchen, peeling potatoes. Anybody in their right mind can imagine what happened to young and pretty girls in concentration camps. And somehow she and a sister figured out that they had to get out of there. Though details are obviously sketchy, she and her sister did leave and wandered around the forest lands for a duration of time until she was rescued by a nun and kept in a basement for a period of time, not seeing the light of day for years. Unfortunately, somewhere in the process, Sonia's sisters died, but through the perseverance of this unnamed nun, who is sitting beside God today as a tzaddik, Sonia received safe passage to Sweden, where she had an uncle. It was there that she met her husband Natan and had 2 children, my mother's first cousins, and settled in Malmö, south of Sweden, in southern Sweden, until she died several years ago after living a long life. As a side note, I noticed today in the Yisker book that Sonia's name is perpetuated in Beth Yeshurun memory as my mother posted it this morning. I remember some and are reminded of others of the efforts that our family undertook to even figure out that we had any relatives. Remember, my grandmother died before I was born. I learned that the family made contact with her in what was the usual fashion in the times through ads in Jewish newspapers. We finally made contact, and actually the first of our family to meet her were my dad's parents. I remember my grandmother returning to New York beaming because Sonia reminded her of my mom's own mother, who she had known very well when my parents were growing up. It was a small-knit community in the Bronx. A few years later, my mom finally met Sonia when the family came to New York for the first time. I was later fortunate enough to spend a summer with my family in Sweden. Sonia and her family became integrated into ours as quickly as we could, and she and her husband Natan even stepped in as surrogate grandparents at my sister Amy's wedding in 1990. Sonia never really liked to talk about the Holocaust, but we tried to get out of her what we could. She suffered deeply from migraines, probably attributable to the trauma. One thing I do remember is that at a party at our house back in the early 80s, she sought out a survivor who was also in attendance, and I remember the bond that the survivors had trying to figure out who knew who might have survived, what might have happened to somebody. It was a desperate conversation. They weren't necessarily from the same place. It's almost people from Dallas meeting people from Houston trying to figure out what happened somewhere in the world, and it didn't. Before the Holocaust, the people in the Jewish community had the same family gatherings as we did. They held the same values and the same customs. Life's simplest pleasures were most rewarding. The Holocaust ripped people of their dignity, something I don't have to share with you. But one thing I caught odd was how jealous Holocaust survivors feel just to be attending a funeral, even of a person who died before the time. They were robbed of their dignity, the privilege to mourn appropriately, and even the sanctity of the death process. There weren't ever any kever kedushas for those people. Many families have stories like this. It's our job to perpetuate them. The question is how? I don't think that any one way is wrong. Obviously, to some, the answer is easy. Here in Houston, for example, we have one of the finest Holocaust museums in the world. Many and most cities have them. I would suggest that one way to perpetuate is to make a point to visit, especially with young people. It would be a great activity to schedule time to do it once a year to maintain that the story remains alive. One of my recent favorite stories about the perpetuation of the Holocaust involves an Israeli hockey player named Eliazza Sherbatov, who is a captain of Israel's national hockey team, which incidentally is rated 36th in the world. He recently joined a team from the city of Auschwitz. It's a city where the Auschwitz concentration camp was situated. This move was met by furor by some in the Israeli community as he was labeled a traitor. His response that for a Jew to play for a team in that city, he serves as a reminder that we're not going to take it, and he decided to play for the memory of those who perished. I got to tell y'all, I love it. If that's his way of perpetuating the memory of who perished, I don't see an argument against it. I love the way our religious-themed schools handle perpetuation, such as the way Emory Weiner does. Let me give you an example as to how that affected me. As many of you know, I spend a lot of time on the golf course. On Sunday mornings, I typically tiptoe out of the house so I don't wake Melanie up. One Sunday morning, a Mother's Day, about 7 or 8 years ago, was a little different. Melanie was already up as she was speaking to Cameron, our son, who was visiting one of the concentration camps along with his classmates at Emory Weiner. He'd called that day because that was the day the trip focused on a mass grave that was used for the bodies of mother and children who were brutally murdered. I don't usually hang around the house on Sundays because I'm out the door to go play. I was a little late that day. I could hear from Melanie's side of the conversation that this was a very difficult day for Cameron and his friends. Later that morning, I remember being consumed during a whole round of golf over where the kids were that day. Most of my golf partners have kids right at the same age we did, and others golfing that day literally had kids in the same place as Cameron was. I remember vividly walking from one hole to the next, asking one of my partners if he thought that all of the kids situated at Auschwitz that day could comprehend that the same people who were driven to their gruesome deaths were exactly the same people who today live in Bel Air. These people who were murdered live the exact same lifestyles that we do here in America today. 3 years before it, those mothers in the graves were doing exactly what the mothers here do. just without the large SUVs, the Lululemons, and the iPhones. In order to make sure that this doesn't happen again, we have to perpetuate the memories, and any way that happens is fine with me. One thing I think we have to do is unite. I often hear differentiating between whether or not people are Jewish Americans or American Jews. Many of those who are herded off would be telling the guards that they were German or Polish or whatever the nationality was. That didn't work real well. It also didn't matter whether they were Reformed, Conservative, or Orthodox. The point of this is that we're all Jews and we're all in this together, and we must be united in our front to put this on the front burner and perpetuate the memory to let future generations know that we are simply not going to take it. Another thing we can do is support Israel more. We're all supporters of Israel, but there's always room for more. I'm not talking about Israeli bonds, that's been done earlier. I'm talking about standing up for its existence on its terms. I'm talking about doing on campuses what Texas A&M does. Confront and oppose the BDS movement and not allow it and protest it. I've heard the argument that if Israel was not in existence, or if Israel was in existence, the Holocaust doesn't happen. I'd like to think that's true, but I don't want to live to see the other side of it, which is why it is important that people think of showing support to organizations like FIDF, which takes care of those who protect Israel. Another way to perpetuate the Holocaust memory is harping on what Rabbi Strauss said during Rosh Hashanah. This synagogue, Beit Knesset, is a house of gathering. When the survivors left, they've proved that anybody could pray without a synagogue, without a Beit Knesset. But one of the first things they did was all gather to be together in worship space like this. I would love to close by saying that we have an easy road of perpetuation ahead of us with all the resources that we have. The truth is, that's not going to be easy. It's easy to forget what happened in the past. We have to collectively make the effort to make sure this doesn't happen again. The natural lifestyle of survivors are winding down, but we have to assure that the stories they tell never die. Next year, I hope to be invited back to tell the story of the trip I had hoped to be able to be speaking about this year. From my family to yours, the children, our in-laws, and everybody, our parents, I wish you all, Melanie and I wish you all Gamar Hatima Tova.